Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello, welcome to a special edition of Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Ciadello.
The midterms, was it a blue wave, a red wall, a victory for President Trump or a shattering defeat? America can't even agree on what just happened.
Well, I've got the traditional election freedom shirt on and I am ready to escape the Oval Office for a live edition of the Armchair Experts. We're going to be checking in with the chief poobah of political science, Larry Sabato.
A big show. We'll look at what happens next and ask, are more heads about to roll?
Spoiler alert, probably. Let's get going.
First to the big news of the week, and the Democratic Party has regained control of the US House of Representatives for the first time in 8 years in what was their biggest net gain since Watergate. Needing 218 seats for a majority, Democrats have at least 223 to the Republicans' 198, with around a dozen districts still to be declared. It was a different story in the Senate, where Democrats were defending 10 states Trump won in 2016. Republicans are projected to have picked up 4. The biggest surprise, Democrat Bill Nelson, who had been leading most polls, looks like he's been tipped out in Florida. Former Republican Governor Rick Scott, with a winning margin of just 30,000 votes out of more than 8 million cast, that is recount territory. In Indiana, Democrat Joe Donnelly couldn't hang on to a state Donald Trump won by 19 points in 2016 in another result that went against most opinion polls. Donnelly losing by more than 7 points to Republican Mike Braun. Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill was unable to hold on in Missouri either, another deep red state that went for Trump by 19 points. Josh Hawley will be the next senator for the Republican Party with a 6-point win. And in North Dakota, as expected, Democrat Heidi Heitkamp lost her Senate seat by double digits to Republican Kevin Cramer. Democrats held on, though, in West Virginia, a state Donald Trump won by 40 points. Joe Manchin, again, cheating death. Democrat Jackie Rosen has also snatched Nevada off incumbent Dean Heller in the only Republican loss of the night. Presumably, based on those pickups in the Senate and rather overlooking the House result, President Trump was very upbeat on Twitter.
Tremendous success. Big victory. Incredible midterm election. Big win. To any of the pundits or talking heads that do not give us proper credit for this great midterm election, just remember 2 words: fake news.
Give him proper credit, pundit. Give him proper credit.
Okay. Look, George W. Bush had quite a different reaction to that in 2006 after he suffered a large loss of seats in the midterms.
If you look at race by race, it was close. The cumulative effect, however, was not too close. It was a thumping.
A thumping? And that was after Bush lost 6 fewer House seats than Trump is projected to have lost just now. To be fair, though, to give him proper credit, Trump's House loss really wasn't that big. Historically speaking, the Dems won about 7% more of the vote. They're still counting, which is a smaller margin than in 2006 or 2008, and only slightly larger than the 2014 margin. And if we go back even further, the average swing since World War II against a sitting president is 7.3%. The swing just now, since the last House election, is 8.1%. So it's pretty much a standard midterms result. But here's the interesting bit. The average seats lost since World War II is 25. And right now, the Republicans are projected to have lost 37 seats. So in other words, never mind those concerns about gerrymandering, the Republicans lost more seats than you would have expected them to lose with that kind of popular vote swing. Something else that didn't quite turn out as expected was the number of women elected. A huge record number of 235 women ran for Congress this year. But unfortunately, only about 100 won, which was only 15 more than the previous record. And remember, there are 435 seats in the House, so that's like 23%. As for the Senate and governor's races, women only match the previously held records. That's 23 out of 100 and 9 out of 50. So that's not bad, but not quite what many had hoped. But something which did pan out was the turnout. Around 114 million voters are projected to have turned out this week, which is 30 million more than the last midterms and 23 million more than the 2010 midterms. It was actually close to the presidential turnout numbers in 2012 and 2016. The turnout was especially big in Texas, where the Cruz O'Rourke contest went nuts. But O'Rourke actually won more raw votes in Texas than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, which is pretty amazing stuff. But most of the story in the Senate was obviously pro-Trump. As John said, Trump targeted those red Senate seats with his rally locations and with all his chatter about the immigration caravan and the Kavanaugh hearings, and it worked. 4 Democrat incumbents were defeated. Now that hasn't happened since 1934. One more thing about the Senate. You mentioned before the Republicans are projected to win 54 seats because the Arizona count's still going, Florida's heading for a recount. Right. Both are likely to go Republican, yes.
True.
Now, Democrats are going to be watching those counts very closely because look at the 2020 Senate map. The Democrats would fancy their chances in Maine, Colorado, Arizona and North Carolina. Republicans would fancy their chances in Alabama. But after that, the opportunities get progressively tougher for both sides. In other words, the Democrats would be confident of winning a net 3 seats in the Senate in 2020, but anything more could be beyond them. The difference between 53 and 54 Republican seats in the Senate could be massive in 2 years' time. But any other thoughts before I go to the states?
Well, that is interesting with the Senate, of course, because a little rural state like Wyoming, it gets 2 senators, always Republican, compared to a big blue state like California, which still gets just 2 senators. So there is this sort of bigger picture emerging of the Senate staying in Republican hands against the overall popular vote, which is reflected in both the presidency, usually, and in the House of Representatives. And because of that Senate domination, of course, the Republicans are still dominating the majority on the Supreme Court and other courts as well. So this is kind of the divide I think we're going to be seeing for decades. Also worth noting that in the Georgia and Florida governor's races, Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum were both very much the targets of incredibly thinly veiled racial attacks. Anonymous robocalls in Georgia by somebody impersonating Oprah Winfrey, basically saying only a stupid fat white woman would vote for Stacey Abrams. And in Florida, the state Republican Party ran ads attacking Jewish billionaire donor George Soros, who contributed to the African-American candidate Andrew Gillum and referred to people like them. Who is them? And then, of course, there's President Trump himself, who called Gillum a thief who, quote, lacked the capacity to be governor. Lacking capacity. Once again, seeming to question the intelligence of a black person, which he does often, whether it's Omarosa, Barack Obama or Maxine Waters. It is just a thing with him.
Okay, well, let's talk state governors then.
Right.
Remember, states are important because they pass a lot of the laws and they're the ones that run the federal elections. They set the rules, they make the judgment calls, and sometimes they rig the game just a little bit. And until now, Republicans dominated state governorships. But this week, the Democrats took 7 of them. You can see which states they are there. But importantly, the Dems missed out on 3 of the most sought-after governorships: Florida, Ohio, and Iowa, the 3 states most associated with presidential elections. Of course, for real control of a state, a party needs to hold the governorship and both state houses, what we call a trifecta. Until now, Republicans dominated trifectas as well, 26-8. But this election, the Democrats won 6 of them and the Republicans lost 3. You can see the Democrat pickups there, as well as the Republican pickups and losses. But here is the key. The 3 crucial trifectas that Democrats couldn't deprive the Republicans of were Florida, Ohio, and Iowa. The Republicans kept all 3. That may come back to haunt the Democrats in 2020. Finally, to the ballot questions, and these were some of the propositions that got up. Colorado, Michigan, and Missouri all voted for independent electorate drawing. Utah still counting. Arkansas and North Carolina toughened up their voter ID requirements. Arkansas and Missouri have increased the minimum wage. The very red states, Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah, have done the very blue state thing being of expanding Medicaid healthcare for the poor. The fossil fuel companies spent over $70 million opposing 3 climate change propositions, and it mostly worked. Washington's carbon fee got voted down. Arizona's renewable energy target got voted down, but Nevada's survived. Missouri passed their extremely strange resolution to minimize the time needed to beat an organization before you can call bingo there. Alabama and West Virginia affirmed that they will ban abortion as soon as the Supreme Court allows them to, and the 2 big ones. Firstly, Michigan, Utah, and Missouri have liberalized their pot laws, joining a long line of states with legal, medical, or recreational marijuana. Legal pot now has 66% support, and given that the 2 arch enemies of pot, Jeff Sessions and the departing House Rules Committee Chair Pete Sessions, have both just lost their jobs, I wouldn't put it past Trump to start talking about national legalization before 2020. We shall see. And finally, Florida has allowed 1.4 million ex-felons the right to vote again, which some people, say will be a vote bonanza for the Democrats. But maybe not, because in 2011, 150,000 ex-felons were also given the right to vote. And this is what happened. The black ex-felons had a turnout rate of 16%. The non-black ex-felons had a turnout rate of 12%. Now it's true that 87% of the black ex-felons registered as Democrats, but only 34% of the non-black ex-felons registered as Democrats. 40% of them registered as Republicans. And when a study added that all up, they estimated that these trends applied to the 1.4 million ex-felons now would lead to 48,000 extra votes for the Democrats. Not a massive difference, although admittedly, in Florida, that's the margin in every second election.
Yeah, or 535 votes in the 2000 election. You're right, we don't quite agree on this because I'm not sure those numbers are even relevant. It was only at the time for a select group of non-violent criminals. In 2011, Republican Governor Rick Scott toughened up the rules, so you had to go to an office in Tallahassee to apply to get all of your civil rights restored. You had to have your case reviewed, maybe have a hearing, and then apply to the governor personally. So lots and lots of hoops and hurdles to go through and over.
But that was not for the 150,000, that was after them.
Right,
yeah.
But that is the rule. And this affects currently, this group of 1.4 million affects 40% of all black men in the state of Florida. Now, for that small group that you were talking about, they might have wanted their civil rights restored for other reasons, to seek a pardon so they could be qualified for a particular job, get their parole conditions lifted, get a gun licence, not simply because they were just desperate to vote. Now, this amendment is for all ex-felons except murderers and rapists. It's old people, it's young people, it's people who might have committed a minor crime as a teenager who are now 50 and have never been allowed to vote in their life. It tells all of them this is their ticket to full citizenship and redemption. I think it will almost surely lead to a big registration drive and a higher vote turnout than that piddling amount that you're talking about. But of course, we'll see.
It'll take us up in 2 years.
Yeah. Now, we're joined once again by the doyen of American political scientists, Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia's Centre for Politics. Larry, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's zoom out a little bit, have a look at the big picture first. How do you think historians and political scientists like yourself are going to look back on the 2018 midterms? How is it going to be summed up, do you think?
It will be summed up as the Donald Trump midterm, which is exactly the way he wants it. He likes to be the center of attention at all times. And the vast majority of people who came out to vote not necessarily for individual candidates, but to signal their strong support or strong opposition for Donald Trump.
Larry, Donald Trump just lost the House, but he never did a lot of legislating anyway. What he did do was appoint a lot of judges and appoint a lot of dubious administration staff. And now he's got 54 seats, we think, in the Senate to do it with. He can ignore the moderates completely. So has he just amassed more power than he had before the election?
He's amassed more in some ways, but he lost a great deal of power in others. Look, he has had legislation that mattered because he had Republicans in control of both houses. For example, his tax cut and deregulation pieces of legislation. There will be no more of that, that's for certain. Now, the Democrats won't be able to get what they want either because they can't get anything past the Senate, or they can't get Trump to sign anything that's truly controversial with the right. So as far as the Senate's concerned, yes, it's now going to be much easier for him to get judges through. He's not going to have any trouble getting his preferred appointments for the cabinet, which could really matter in the case of Attorney General, because the Attorney General could shut down the investigation into Donald Trump. But the House also is trying to get his tax returns, and they're going to take the eventual report about Russia and do something with it. We'll have a lot of investigations over the next 2 years.
Ultimately, though, Larry, does that hyperpartisanship, division and gridlock equal Conservatives are winning because they don't think the government should be that active, whereas Democrats who want government to be more active in people's lives are being thwarted by this?
Well, you could make that argument, I suppose, but it's also true that now Donald Trump won't be able to get anything passed on his side of government either. And Republicans today are very activist in their direction. You know, they've added $1 trillion a year to the national deficit. That's a debt, rather. That's not the way it used to be. Republicans used to fight deficits and want to reduce the national debt. So again, you really need a scorecard to keep up with the players over here.
The Democrats might believe they now have a roadmap to winning the House, but this election campaign cost $5.2 billion, and the majority of that was raised by the Democrats and their army of small donors. Now, you might not be able to pump those small donors for that much money every single election campaign. It seems like a Trump special to me. So my question is this method of campaign sustainable for the Democrats every time?
It's going to be sustainable for as long as Donald Trump is in power. Once he goes, it depends on who's in charge, but Donald Trump is really despised on the Democratic side, and average Democrats will sometimes give money they don't have. That's how strongly they feel about it. But let me put this in perspective. Yes, it's true, this election campaign, counting both parties together, cost more than $5 billion. And you know what Americans spent on Halloween candy and costumes? $9 billion.
It's hard to know which is worse for our collective health, Larry. I wonder, though, going through the crosstabs, what do you think geographically and demographically happened in this election? Did we learn anything about the kind of the realignment of the parties?
We did indeed. The rural areas in America have become even redder than they were when they elected Donald Trump. They made the difference for Trump in the key states that put him over the top in the Electoral College. They're even more Republican now. They're going to be behind Trump with larger turnouts and a larger percentage of the vote in 2020. However, at the very same time, the suburbs, which have consistently voted Republican over the years in key elections, have now moved in the other direction. And it's mainly college-educated women who live in the suburbs who are turned off by Donald Trump. I keep mentioning Donald Trump, but you need to understand he's the center of everything here now. You can't have a conversation without discussing Donald Trump. And as I say, he loves it. He spent his whole life trying to get where he is, not president, but the center stage.
Larry, before we let you go, maybe you can settle a little argument between Chaz and I here. When looking at Florida, of course, there was Amendment 4 that passed, which will now re-enfranchise 1.4 million Floridians who are ex-felons and previously not able to vote. They will be able to vote. Given that that includes 40% of black men in the state of Florida, could that tip that important swing state?
Well, first of all, to settle your argument, what's in it for me? I'm not going to get in the middle of
the
that.
knowledge that you're right.
I'm not going to get something out of it. Yeah, I'm expecting a package, if you know what I mean. But look, the truth is, of course, it makes a big difference. There's no question about it. I was surprised that it passed as handily as it did. But I will say this, people are always surprised to learn that even newly re-enfranchised felons are divided on party ID. Now, among African Americans, it's going to be very substantially Democratic. But there are a lot of white felons who would be re-enfranchised too, and many of them are Republicans. They really do vote Republican. So there's less of an impact, and they'll have to register to vote and then actually show up and vote. We put 2 barriers in front of people before they can vote. So I think it's being exaggerated. The effect is being exaggerated, and I think I have allowed you both to win the argument.
Yeah, no, I think I won that. Actually.
No, I think I won that.
I think I won that.
I think I definitely won that, John.
I think I won that. Larry, thank you so much for being with us again.
Then I want a package from both of you. I want a package from both of you then.
Small one.
Okay. All right. I enjoyed being with you.
Thanks so much, Larry. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
The morning after the midterms, President Trump called a White House press conference. He talked for about 90 minutes and he had a fight with CNN's Jim Acosta.
CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN.
It was pretty remarkable. The White House Press Secretary, Sarah Sanders, then tweeted out a video which had been doctored, slowed down and sped up at different times by InfoWars to make it look like Acosta had hit the intern who tried to take his mic away from him. The real-time video, though, shows a very different picture. Acosta was gesturing to the president, not karate chopping her arm. Still, the White House press office pulled Acosta's credentials. While all of that was going on, President Trump didn't actually mention that he'd just sacked his Attorney General. He saved that for Twitter.
We are pleased to announce that Matthew G. Whitaker, Chief of Staff to Attorney General Jeff Sessions at the Department of Justice, will become our new acting Attorney General of the United States. He will serve our country well. We thank Attorney General Jeff Sessions for his service and wish him well. A permanent replacement will be nominated at a later date.
With Sessions gone, his Chief of Staff, Matt Whitaker, assumed responsibility as well for oversight of the Russia investigation, headed by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had been performing that task, of course, after Sessions recused himself last year. Rosenstein was overlooked, and so his future is very much in doubt. But then again, there are also big doubts about Matt Whitaker. His past comments critical of Mueller's inquiry and support, particularly for Donald Trump Jr. taking that infamous Trump Tower meeting in 2016 with Russians offering dirt on Hillary Clinton, could prove rather problematic.
To suggest that there's a conspiracy here, I mean, you would always take that meeting. You would have somebody from your campaign
would always take
the meeting to try to get the information. If you have somebody that you trust that is saying you need to meet with this individual because they have information about your opponent, you would take that meeting.
OK, and then there was this op-ed for CNN Online where Whitaker said that Mueller would be crossing a red line if he started looking into Trump's business dealings as a part of the Russia probe, writing, quote, "That goes beyond the scope of the appointment of the special counsel." Now, Chaz, Democrats want Whitaker to recuse himself from oversight of Mueller. They also want to know if President Trump may have improperly interfered with the Mueller probe by appointing somebody he knew had called the special counsel investigating him a little bit fishy. Maybe that is why former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie suddenly turned up at the White House earlier today. He is certain to be on the shortlist for the Attorney General spot. And at this point, you'd think, Chaz, with Whitaker only having 210 days as a kind of interim appointment, that Chris Christie would have a better chance of being confirmed by the Senate next year.
Yeah. Look, we're learning a lot about this sacking every hour, so I might save my views for next week. But I just want to point out two things. One, if Trump scored such tremendous success on Tuesday, like he says, it's odd that he'd immediately step on that good news by sacking Sessions the very next day. That's more the kind of timing that Trump displays when he's burying disappointments. Secondly, I don't know why Trump sacked Sessions, but I do know that now Trump's cleared 54 votes in the Senate, he can ignore the objections of moderates when appointing replacements. And he can do a lot more of exactly this kind of thing. So buckle up for the next 2 years.
I can't hardly wait. But now, we'd better skedaddly do, because we've got an expert panel waiting for us just down the road, not to mention a live audience and hot dogs. So let's go.
Yes.
Welcome to Sydney's Giant Dwarf Theatre for a special edition of the Armchair Experts focusing on the midterms. It's exciting to be here, Chaz.
It is. Finally someone knows what they're talking about.
I know. Joining us, we've got Charles Edel. He was a member of the Obama State Department and an advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry. Would you make Charles welcome? Barb Heinbach is here. She served in the Carter White House in the late 1970s as press officer to First Lady Rosalind Carter. She's with us as well. Barb, welcome to you. Kim Hoggart is here with us as well. She served in the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations. Kim, welcome.
Thank you.
And the CEO of the United States Studies Centre, Simon Jackman, is here. Simon, welcome to you. Thank you. Now, the first question, and I think it's important that we involve the audience in all of this. The first question we're going to ask is, such a good question.
That's very good.
Simon Jackman, you are the expert on polling. What did just happen?
The Democrats took the House and have thrown an important wrench, if you will, in the works. Will slow down the Trump administration. So in order for legislation, anything Trump needs legislatively, there's going to be some compromise. And compromise and Trump aren't two words we typically put together, so we'll see how that goes. But secondarily, and I think perhaps of more political drama over the opening months of 2019 when this new Congress gets seated, is now that Democrats will control important committee chairs. And subpoenas are going to be raining down on the Trump White House and the executive branch more generally. And talk about slowing down the machinery of government when you're batting away subpoenas and being investigated by Congress. And there's no doubt in my mind that that'll be a big part of what the Democrats will do now that they've got control of the House.
Of course, Kim, in the Senate, it's a very different story. How relieved and or pleased are Republicans feeling at the fact that they've managed to pick up a couple of Senate seats in what had been shaping up to be a blue wave year?
Yes, well, Trump obviously is pleased that there was a red wall to stop the tsunami of a blue wave. But I would also say that what's just happened has been a reset in the American political system, and I think it was an important point. It was a tipping point, really, I think, for America and for the rest of us observing from overseas to see what direction the Americans wanted to go, and whether it was going to be a rubber stamp of this president or whether there was going to be a bit of a reset. But I think we can see that the change that is happening in America has been coming for many, many decades, and it takes a while for Americans to change course, but we're seeing, I think, a bit of a course correction.
Barb, what did you make of President Trump's reaction to not perhaps a shellacking in the House such as Barack Obama suffered in 2010, but it was still, by historical standards, about 50% worse than average in the House this week. The next morning he turns around and he sacks Jeff Sessions, his Attorney General. Were the two linked, do you think?
Everyone knew that Sessions was going, soon after, the next day, but sometime in the first week or so. That's been planned for a long time, and the fact that Sessions didn't bow out on his own is pretty interesting out of, don't you have any self-respect, man? You're not very welcome where you are right now for the last year. But he didn't take a shellacking, and when you look at Clinton having lost 53 seats, and Obama more than anyone, 63. He lost about, 30 seats we're looking at? So that's what's expected, 28 to 38 seats. And also you're going to lose 5 or 6 in the Senate. Well, he gained 3 or 3++ in the Senate. We'll see how that goes. I was very pleased to see in this election, Trump talks about make America great again. One thing he has achieved, he's making voting great again, or for the first time in America. We saw so many young people coming out. We saw so many women coming out to vote, and not just to vote, but to really participate in the governmental process. So many women, so many veterans. It's interesting, see how that goes. But I had been involved with Emily's List years ago when the percentage of women in government leading positions were 1 to 3%, depending on how you looked at it. And now we're up to, I think Simon said, about 25%?
Yeah, and
so,
well ahead of Australia, by the way, on female representation in the parliament.
Yeah, so we're getting there.
Charles, how do you square that? Because in the 2016 election, the sort of relentless negativity of that campaign drove down turnout, certainly on the Democratic side. This time it seems that Trump, or reaction to Trump, has driven up turnout on both sides.
Really, the number one issue seemed to be Trump and how you folded that in, either love of him or hate of him. But it's more than just that, because you have to lower the gaze down to the state level, down to the municipal level too. So one of the things that Nancy Pelosi said last night in her victory speech was we ran the campaign that we wanted to, which was focusing not on Trump, but picking candidates who would work on particular local issues. And that actually seemed to have a galvanizing effect for the Dems in local races. So Trump has been an exceedingly polarizing figure. That is not going to change. And I actually agree exactly with what Barb has said here, that you're seeing civic engagement go up across the board for different motivations coming out of this election.
That brings us to our second question, and that is... Such a good question. Simon Jackman, who did make it happen?
Donald Trump.
On both sides?
Yeah, absolutely on both sides. So the turnout numbers are staggering. Relative to the last midterm election in 2014, turnout is up by at least 45% relative to the last midterm. And it takes a Donald Trump to do that. The counter-mobilization among Democrats has been staggering, number one. But number two, particularly after the Kavanaugh nomination, Republicans got their moxie back. And I think that whole process reminded Republicans what was at stake, particularly in the Senate. And that's that judicial appointment power, particularly of the highest courts in the land, the Supreme Court in particular. And Trump inserted himself back into the game big time with those rallies. It was about him because that played very well with the Republican base, where he enjoys a 90% approval rating among self-identified Republicans. By the end of the campaign, the enthusiasm gap between Democrats and Republicans had gone away. The last week of polling showed that Republicans were as interested and as enthused about voting as Democrats were. That wasn't the case pre-Kavanaugh.
But for different reasons.
Right,
They were afraid.
Right.
Well, of course, I'd say people who voted against him were afraid too. But you also, I agree, definitely Trump was really the one that helped motivate both sides to get out and vote. But also, there was such a shock to the system in 2016, and the Democrats have spent so much time in the last 2 years cultivating voters, new registrations, the Parkland shooting with young people going on a bus around the country specifically to register new young voters. That's been going on for 2 years. And so it's a matter of fact that Republicans have always been the party that gets out the vote. For some reason, they can get out the vote, but they don't have the numbers. That's why they're so good at getting the vote out. If the Democrats actually got up and went and voted, they would win every election. But they don't, and they're never good at getting the vote out. Partly it's because a lot of their voters are on a low socioeconomic scale. They may have trouble with voter registration. All the states are different, so there's all these obstacles to getting Democrats to the polls sometimes.
I think another aspect's probably the fact there's a lot of older voters who vote Republican,
Yes.
and the older voters always turn out.
And they're loyal,
Yeah,
and they do it.
Simon mentioned Kavanaugh.
Yes.
How much effect do you think that had on the Senate result? Because you look at Missouri, Indiana, North Dakota, the people who voted against Kavanaugh got spanked. Montana, now he only just snuck home John Tester, and he was a very good candidate.
Yes.
He voted against Kavanaugh. And
Yep.
on the other hand, the most lopsided electorate of all was West Virginia,
Yes.
and Joe Manchin got through because he voted for Kavanaugh.
Yes.
So how much effect do you think that had?
Well, obviously, when you lay it out like that, it had a lot to do with it. But I think it motivated the base. So again, it's the fear factor. You know, Trump won his election based on driving home this fear in America that because it's changing. The demographics in America are changing, and white males in particular don't like it. You know, so yes, he was able to get out there and say, we need a conservative on the Supreme Court, and if you don't vote for me, we're going to lose this conservative edge. And so that's how he motivated people. And yes, people were upset with the way Brett Kavanaugh was treated. Women were upset with how women who made allegations against him were treated. So it motivated voters on both sides. But I think it was probably more beneficial to the Republicans.
Barb, what's your take on that? Did Democrats fall into a Trump trap by it becoming so contentious with Brett Kavanaugh towards the end there?
Absolutely, because the moment that Dianne Feinstein brought up this case of, under the Kavanaugh thing with Dr. Ford, and I thought to myself, okay, now that's going to rally the Republicans to get out the vote. Everything that Dr. Ford said, her four or five main allegations, there were 5, they all got shot down. None of them held water. And then with her 4 witnesses, none of those witnesses would come out for her. Her one of her best friends said, no, I can't show up. I don't remember that. The guys didn't remember. There before she had nothing going for her, and there was no collaboration, nothing to stand on. So I called it the KC factor, and I don't mean Kentucky Fried. I'm talking Kavanaugh and the caravan, because they really were serious issues. We heard Obama say a few years back, and Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein, no, we can't have people crashing down our borders. What did you hear the Democrats saying the last few weeks before the election? They all talked about, oh, it doesn't mean anything, they're 1,000 miles away. And you don't rally 7,000 people into a caravan happenstance. That had to have been organized.
On that note, Charles, Republicans were clearly trying to make the caravan the story of the last few weeks. And to some extent, they succeeded. 115 articles in the New York Times and Washington Post alone over 3 weeks. That's a lot of articles. On the other hand, Democrats were clearly trying to make it about healthcare. Over 60% of their ads were about healthcare and pre-existing conditions. Who do you think won the messaging war in the last 3 weeks?
Well, if you look at the House, you have one answer. If you look at the Senate, you have a different answer. If you look at the states, you have yet another answer. So it depends where we look. One thing just as a response, Barb, that caravan certainly was organized in El Salvador by Salvadorians. That's an important point to make.
Not by George Soros.
Not by George Soros.
Charles, there was so much attention on that Senate race in Texas. $70 million raised and spent by Beto O'Rourke to lose a state that Democrats always lose, or have since the 1970s. Was that a folly, or did it plant a flag for the future, do you think?
I think it planted a flag for the future, but it wasn't necessarily just Beto who was planting that flag. If you look at the changing demographics of Texas, the growing suburban areas, what was so interesting in Texas, to my mind, was not what happened in the Senate, but what happened at the congressional level. Because of Beto's long coattails, because of the enthusiasm, the youth vote, the Latino vote that was out there, you had a flip of at least 3, I believe it was more than 3, previously Republican-held congressional seats in Texas going Democrat. That is in some ways the future of where Texas is headed, although we don't know exactly when it's going to arrive there. The other thing, though, that it's really important to note about Beto, one of the reasons why he became this superstar running in a race that in some ways he was never going to win is because you had someone who had a very hopeful message, who was able to drive out the vote and enthuse a lot of people. That's one of the messages that a fair amount of people within the Democratic Party are going to be listening to very carefully as they begin to pick and place their bets for 2020.
Our third question. That is such a good question. Barb, would you like to take this one?
Healthcare is vital. They've got to continue to plug away at that, and I think it's not just vital and important, but I never felt as though, the long-term care, people that had sustaining problems, I never thought that was going to be taken away, but it's got to be clear to the public. The Republicans did a very poor job on selling the health care that they want. I don't think they've figured it out yet. They've only had about, 10 years now? 8 under the previous administration and now another 2. It's Obamacare or Hillary care or Trump care now, whatever you want to call it, has not been working, but it's time for people to sit down and wrap their heads around that, around immigration. I don't suspect that the Democrats are going to want to work on that particular one. Infrastructure is very vital. Our bridges are falling apart and a lot of the highways, road care. So they need infrastructure. That's something they can tackle. Opioids, that's something else that I think Democrats and Republicans can work on together. So there are areas.
So I've got a question, which is, we talk about the House, the effect the House will have versus the Senate. One group of people we're not considering are the 2020 candidates who are going to come out in force in the next week or 2, I expect. It just starts immediately. If you have a situation, Nancy Pelosi has gone on the record saying, I don't want to push for impeachment unless we have something, unless we have a good case. She clearly wants to slow play it. She knows what happened in 1998. She knows that it will be bad for them if they overreach. In the meantime, though, you're going to have these 2020 candidates trying to stand out from the crowd by out-harshing each other. Avenatti will clearly start it. You're going to have people talking about fighting, etc. And they're going to feel pressure to over time, every time there's a scandal, the first question will be, is this an impeachable offence? And some 2020 candidate is going to go, yes. And there'll be people in the House who will feel compelled to join them. Are the 2020 candidates going to drag the Democrats in the Congress to the left to do things they might not otherwise want to do?
Yeah, not just the candidates, but the base.
Yeah.
And this is the tricky thing about the mixed messages that come out of the results. To what extent, if you're a Democratic presidential aspirant right now, what are you thinking? How do you read that message as to where you should position yourself? Now, there's a ton of energy in these Bernie Sanders candidates, particularly, right, that came out of nowhere and knocked off more establishment candidates. How you play this game going forward is really, really interesting, because the other message is that there are some of these really key swing states that aren't quite up for it, you know, and it's quite dicey. So, you know, where are you if you're Cory Booker, Kamala Harris?
Jersey, exactly.
The other one's Pelosi too, her calculus as well. How lefty is this new Democratic caucus? How secure is her job? And maybe she has to do impeachment as a condition for hanging on to her job. You know, there's a few. Winning comes with some strategic calculations to hang on to the prize.
We're running short on time, but Kim Hoggart, I want to hear what you think is going to happen next. For all intents and purposes, do you think Trump's first term is over, at least in a legislative sense? Is it just now all about 2020 and re-election? I'm
not sure that the president's legislative term even started at the beginning, because and that's basically because even though he had control of the House and Senate, he basically did things by executive order. Now they can all be undone by the next president. This is a traditional time to midway through to look at White House staff and maybe change. I'm sure we're going to see, he's already indicated he's going to change a lot of people. The problem for us is who's going to take the job. A lot of my ex-colleagues, people that I know in Washington, aren't interested in working in a Trump administration. They don't see it as a place that's going to necessarily further policy, let alone further their careers, and could be a stigma. From my experience, leadership is all about the type of people you have around you. You're only as good a president as you are the staff that you have, and that's been repeated many, many times. It's just proven. I don't think he has the political nous within his cabinet at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see where he tries to go, and you know, he obviously wants people who are acolytes. So I think if we were able to get a wider base of people advising the president, we might see something done.
And with that, we are right out of time. Would you please thank our panellists? And thank you all very much for joining us for this special live event at the Giant Dwarf Theatre. We'll see you back in the Foval office at the same time next week. Bye for now.